American has the cost base of a Singapore Airlines, and they've been trying to run themselves as AirAsia, right? Like that's like one way of describing it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of season 10 of the Airways podcast. I'm Rohan and Vinay, joined by Vinay. Vinay, how are we doing today?
Doing good. Glad to be on my first new episode of the new year with so many interesting outcomes and things to talk about in the industry.
Yeah. Well, and today I'm doubling down on my love for Air Canada because, I have my zip up hoodie and then I have my little t-shirt behind me. It's February in Chicago, so I'm, feeling all of that, love for the northern neighbor. How have you been and how are your travels?
Well, February in Chicago feels a lot like Canada, so I suppose it's apropos that you're wearing a Canadian hoodie. My travels have been good. I just got back from a long trip to India and to East Asia to South Korea, so still feeling the jet lag. I was out there for a longer window than usual, but got the chance to fly Asiana for the first time, which was very interesting. Got the chance to fly Emirates first in the A380 and finally experience a shower in the sky, which was very, very cool. I'm pretty cynical, pretty jaded at this point about sort of any air travel experience, but the shower in the sky was definitely a cool moment flying on the A380. And then got the chance to try out British Airways in both first class, which I think is underrated, and business class, which I think is overrated.
Really exciting. Yeah, I think that the shower is a bucket list item for many of us. And I think that if you fly Emirates or Etihad, you're going to get the shower experience, if I'm not mistaken, because I know
Et-
Etihad has two
Etihad
showers, I
have the
believe.
shower in the residence, I
Yes.
believe, maybe. Okay,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. And then one for the other first class passengers. The A380 is actually flying routes like Abu Dhabi to Toronto and Sydney. So, routes that it would be worthwhile to splurge on that residence or first class experience. That's really exciting. Good for you. And I'm glad that you're back in the US. And speaking of the US and Canada, we're going to be focusing mostly on North America today for our airline topics. And while you weren't able to join us for the first episode of season 10, where I discussed the situation at Chicago O'Hare between American Airlines and United Airlines, it's great that you're back. And it's also great for you to lend your thoughts on that battle for O'Hare. So we'll start off with a little 2.0 discussion after a few weeks, especially since some new data has come out on the Chicago O'Hare fight and what your thoughts are on the 550 daily departures that United or American will have this summer at O'Hare and 150 plus that United will have.
Yeah, no, it's definitely been fascinating to sort of follow the steadily escalating war for Chicago, the game of one-upmanship that the two airlines have been on. I think there was sort of a sense of kind of American waking as a sleeping giant, right? They've historically been a very, very strong number two in Chicago. And you go back far enough, right, into the 80s and 90s, they were actually the number one player in Chicago, at least when it came to local traffic. Now, I think the more interesting sort of recent development, right, is that post pandemic, American really took their eye off the ball, right? And I think you covered a lot of these themes in your episode a couple weeks ago, and they sort of let their natural share slip behind, right? So, for the last 15 years, American has been at a gate space disadvantage in Chicago. Now, some of that's mediated by the fact that United has a lot more wide body capable gates, and they fly a much larger suite of wide body departures, right? But there's ultimately a 50% advantage that United has in terms of just raw gate space at O'Hare, even if they can't flow as many departures through it because some of those are wide bodies, right? But I'm old enough to remember when Terminal 2 was home to Delta and Alaska, maybe not Alaska, but a series of
Northwest,
non-aligned airlines,
Northwest was
Northwest,
there.
right? So on and
Yeah.
so forth. And now United controls all of Terminal 1 and all of Terminal 2, right? End to end. I think it's 95 or something is the gate number. And so pre-pandemic, despite the fact that United was a larger carrier in the O'Hare market, right? They were, at least 100, 150 daily departures bigger than American. They had a much larger global footprint in terms of especially intercontinental flying. American more than held its own prior to the pandemic, right? They have the history of being kind of the dominant local, the dominant business carrier in the Chicago market. They were pretty even in terms of origin and destination passenger market share in terms of Chicago bound or Chicago based flyers. United obviously just had a bigger operation, so they connected more passengers through O'Hare. Post pandemic, that has really sort of fallen off. And United has kind of to a 60-40 or even a little bit better in terms of local market share and just much more scale, period, in the market. And so I think part of what American was trying to do was to get back to historical parity, right? Even with their growth plans before the most recent surge of United capacity, they were looking at about 650 daily departures. And, American was trying to get back to sort of roughly, let's call it like 45-55 in terms of seat share, market share, frequency share, and getting closer to parity with local market travelers. United took a look at American saying, hey, we want to get back to our historical share and said, nah, we've, really carved out market leadership, which is a little distinct from kind of the, let's call it fortress hub level market dominance that American enjoys in DFW and Charlotte, or that United enjoys, in Houston. We can get to this topic. This is a point I want to make about the fact that United has maybe the best suite of hubs in terms of the underlying market in the United States, right? You look at San Francisco, LAX, New York, Chicago, right? They've got some of the most powerful hub markets in the country. But they also don't dominate those hubs the same way that Delta does in Atlanta or Detroit or Minneapolis, or that American does in DFW and Charlotte and Philly. And so that is, I think, part of the story of what's happening here, right? Is that United maybe saw an opportunity to turn Chicago into that style of hub. American decided to fight back, and now United is continuing to up the ante. Now, I think despite the fact that they've got that 50% advantage in raw gate volume and available gate space, because United flies a much wider suite of intercontinental flying, which requires essentially longer sort of windows to hold those planes at the gates. Their effective advantage is maybe closer to the 30-35% advantage they have right now. But yeah, it'll be fascinating to watch. I think both these airlines are about to lose a lot of money in the Chicago market, at least in terms of the direct flying. Now, both for both carriers, Chicago's a very, very important frequent flyer market in terms of frequent flyer program members, in terms of credit card signups, in terms of corporate travel. So I think a holistic accounting of Chicago's impact on profitability and on the network probably isn't as stark as some of the commentary from Scott Kirby would make it out to be. But I think there's no doubt that, you know, we're in for a very, very interesting battle over the next 12 months. And I'll be curious to see who sort of cries uncle first, right? Now, United has some advantages in the sense that the overall airline is more profitable. I think they have effectively positioned the brand as more premium. And I think that will only continue to escalate as sort of the Starlink aspect of the experience feeds into the rest of the investments that the company's made in the aircraft interiors of the United Next program, in adding seat back screens to the vast majority of domestic planes. But yeah, it will be fascinating to watch because I think both carriers have grown Chicago to a level where it is unsustainable. And my guess is that United will probably break even coming down from a very profitable hub for the last couple of years. And then American will lose a lot of money in 2026, at least on direct flying.
Yeah. So a lot of really good points in there. And I think the first one that I'm going to address is the intercontinental piece, because I think that is one thing that kind of gets lost in this discussion is that American lost a lot of gates at O'Hare because they're based upon utilization. And when those gates were underutilized during the pandemic, that naturally, with their reduction in schedule at O'Hare, led them to lose those gates. My question to you is, with American's long haul schedule out of Chicago largely being seasonal, meaning like between the months of late March to late October for their wide body flights, aside from like, a London Heathrow year round flight, what does that mean exactly for O'Hare and for American in terms of utilizing those gates to make sure that even in the off peak periods, they don't run the chance of losing them? Is that part of why we see them adding all this capacity, even in non-peak times? And resultingly, that's why people believe they're going to lose a bunch of money. Can you expound on that a little bit more? Because I think that that is an interesting data point to go into.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think some of this is down to the fact that uh, I don't know that that's why they're going to necessarily lose a bunch of money. I think that's part of why they've lost a lot of relevance in the market over time, right? United just operates to a much broader suite of international destinations. And so if you are a Chicago based traveler and you're trying to choose which of these airlines to assign your loyalty to, or you're a Chicago based company, you're trying to decide which of these carriers you're going to give your corporate contracts to. If you have any sort of international travel that doesn't exclusively fly to and from London or Tokyo, right? American's international operation could also be seen as a essentially, two hub operation, one across the Atlantic and one across the Pacific, where a lot of the traffic flows. The choice is pretty natural, right? United can just get you to far more places with a nonstop flight than American can, right? And this is downstream of decisions that American made coming out of the pandemic to retire its fleet of A330s and 767s, and frankly 757s, right? Because those 757s could have flown flights from JFK and Philadelphia that now, or even Miami, that now tie up, 787, right? So, none of that is new. I do think that the volume of flights and how that interplays with, let's say, gate allocations is a little bit distinct from the intercontinental flying, right? The intercontinental flying helps explain why United has surged ahead in terms of local passenger market share in the Chicago area, in terms of frequent flyer market share and revenue and profitability, frankly, given the overarching trend we've seen towards sort of international flying, towards premium leisure flying, right? That explains why United is doing better in the market. I don't think it really has as much of an explanatory power when it comes to the sort of drop off in gate allocation, right? That's just downstream of where American chose to allocate capacity. And if you look at what American did coming out of the pandemic, they chose to bulk up in the Sun Belt. They chose to grow DFW. They chose to grow Charlotte. They chose to continue to invest in Phoenix and some of the other hubs, in Miami and so on and so forth. And so downstream of that, I think it actually is ultimately domestic volume, domestic capacity and short haul capacity is what drives frequency. And that's a little divorced from the intercontinental flying. Now, you might say separately that, hey, if you've got more international intercontinental flights to Europe and to Asia and to South America, that allows you to fly a larger, bulkier domestic schedule because you have more connecting opportunities to help fill those planes. But I think ultimately frequency, right? You could fly 100 daily departures on 50-seat jets if you were so inclined, right? So I think it's actually more so about where American chose to invest and chose to deploy capacity and deploy planes.
Another thing I think that people must remember is that the negotiation for a lot of these gates and for the O'Hare 21 plan, which was signed, I think, in 2018, has American receiving five more gates from like the L Concourse or something. And it has American investing in a new Admirals Club in Concourse L. And it has also, the backing of people like Matt Pieper, who's now the chief commercial officer at American. So we see a lot of carrots that are out there for American. We just don't know where the sticks are attached to them. And for all intents and purposes, we see that American is also really struggling to get this year off on the right footing with the storm Fern, that meltdown that took place, the people that are not championing Robert Isom as a CEO for the carrier, largely from the front lines. And what no one wants from a customer perspective is for this summer to resemble the summer of 2000, like the summer of hell. That's what it was called for United Airlines, where you have a lot of very disgruntled employees and you have a slowdown at work and the capacity that O'Hare is going to be at for this summer. If Mother Nature isn't forgiving, or if there's some sort of crisis, is the infrastructure going to be equipped to handle that many flights from both American and United? And so that kind of stirs up in my head with regards to like carrots, sticks, and what exactly is going to tie it all together, because no one really has any idea of how this will pan out until the numbers come in, right? This may be the busiest schedule that both airlines have ever flown at this hub. It's kind of like the battle for Seattle on steroids, effectively. So, with that said, some people that have taken a more long term prediction have said that both airlines are going to lose some money, but neither airline is going to blink exactly, meaning those airlines will probably come back to their equilibrium, whatever that may be. Maybe it's 450 flights for American, 650 for United, and they're just going to revert back to their quasi status quo.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think remember, right, that while both carriers are offering their biggest historical schedules at O'Hare, that part is for sure. O'Hare is a fundamentally different airport than it was in summer of 2000, right? They did a lot of work over the course of the 2000s and the twins to reconfigure the runway architecture and the runway setup at O'Hare to make it a much more operationally efficient and operationally capable airport, right? The irony of O'Hare is that, relative to the summer of 2000, as an airport, it can probably better handle the capacity and better handle the flight volumes that it has. Now, it is, fair to say United, if you look at summer of 2003 is the earliest data that we have access to in Syria, right? But summer of 2003, they're operating about 630 daily departures from O'Hare. American is operating about 500 daily departures from O'Hare, right? So it's about 1,150 daily departures. If you layer in sort of Northwest and Continental and US Airways, right? If you layer in sort of US Airways onto the American, right, they get to, about 500 daily departures. And if you layer in Continental, you get to about 650 daily departures, right? So that 500 and 650 is where they were sort of historically in the early 2000s. Now, that's a lot of smaller aircraft. The amount of capacity is a good deal more here. I don't know that we're quite in store for a summer from hell from an airfield capacity perspective. It's worth remembering that O'Hare at one point had slot constraints, right? The same way that JFK and LaGuardia and DCA do. The airfield capacity has grown to such an extent that the constraint on operations isn't the ability to have a plane take off and land. There's more than enough capacity for that. The actual constraint on air operations is gate space. Now, the version of a summer from hell that you might have in 2026 is a bunch of planes spending time in the penalty box, right? And sitting out on the tarmac waiting for a gate. That is a all too common story and an all too common experience at O'Hare as it started to get gate constrained. But fundamentally, I don't think you're in for this quite the same style of operational meltdown because the airfield capacity is just fundamentally way better in terms of the parallel takeoff and landing capacity of the airport now.
Sure. And another thing that I don't think people are really mentioning that kind of factors in, but may not to some degree, is Chicago is actually a three hub airline or three airline hub market. They have Southwest Airlines at Midway, and they also have Southwest Airlines at O'Hare now. And Southwest is starting to interline and code share with a couple of international airlines that fly into Terminal 5, like EVA Airlines or Turkish Airlines. And while minimal, those code shares can still at least drive some incremental traffic over to Southwest. And Southwest is unbundling, it's revamping its model itself. How does it factor into all of this?
Yeah. I mean, my guess, right, is that sort of the newly Elliottified Southwest takes a look at Midway and says, maybe we pull back here. Now, there's some constraints there in the sense that I don't think they would want to pull too far back to, concede the local market. But there are going to be destinations that Southwest serves where it competes for local traffic with American and with United, where it may pull back on capacity. It may drop a daily flight here or there in a given market, or it may drop a couple of markets altogether. You look at some of the advanced fares for travel from O'Hare for the summer, you have sub $100 segment fares on 2, 3, 4 hour flights being filed pretty much all across the country, right? United's about to fly 7 daily flights into DFW. They're about to fly 5 into Charlotte. I mean, you can go market by market and talk about the volume of capacity being crazy. Without sort of getting into the weeds, I'm not going to go ahead and make a prediction as to where Southwest might specifically make cuts on a market by market basis. But, deploying a 10% haircut to their Midway footprint and their Midway operation and using those planes to help fund their growth ambitions in places like Nashville, in places like Austin, where they're in a very pitched battle, seemingly all of a sudden with Delta, even in Denver, right? To the degree that United is growing a ton in Chicago O'Hare, how much space does that give them to grow in Denver? Does that give Southwest an opportunity to say, hey, we'll sort of concede a little bit of ground in Chicago, but why not ratchet up the pressure somewhat in Denver? So I think the machinations here get very, very interesting, where Southwest is always going to have its sort of loyal corner. The sort of, I call it the Southwest cult, right? Where people are just so pre-programmed to navigate to southwest.com and book a Southwest ticket, even if it, in many cases these days, is by no means the lowest fare, and in some cases, frankly, more expensive than the legacy carriers for 1/100th of the value, some might argue, right? But hold that aside. I think they'll always have kind of their corner. They've got a loyal flyer base, they've got a frequent flyer base. But to the degree that some of the capacity they have in Midway today is about flowing connections across the country, they've got plenty of places to connect passengers on that sort of east-west flow or into the Midwest, right? They've got a major operation in St. Louis. Some of that flow can be handled by Denver for transcontinental connections. And that flow can be handled by Baltimore for connections into the Northeast, right? So you've got other places where you're not going to lose anywhere near as much money as you will, as the sort of like third leg of the tripod in this
Yeah.
increasingly pitched battle. And so I would guess that they probably pull back on the margins. And they were talking about this anyway, right? Even as they started to shift towards boom towards a hub, Midway has weakened as a performer for Southwest over the years. And so I think you could see that trend accelerate, especially with the split operation across at O'Hare.
Yeah. And kind of within that frame, I feel like the the Southwest effect, right? We talk about how it's no longer really a Southwest effect, but there will potentially be customers spilled from Spirit if they choose not to go on, or if they have more gates to relinquish at O'Hare or at some other markets that Southwest American or United want to get those gates at, right? And there could be some trickle down effect into O'Hare and how that, kind of smooth things out. But fundamentally speaking, I think that we will really need to look into the data when the fall winter period comes around next year, with the load factor and yield information and how that might affect the summer of 2027 after all these capacity additions.
Yeah. And it's worth calling out, right, that, ran some numbers in the background as you were kind of laying that out. United will be about 20% larger in terms of departure volume relative to the summer of 2003, but about 35% larger in terms of daily departing seats. American will be, a little bit sort of more aligned. They're about 10% up on departures because this has been that sort of sinusoidal wave of kind of waxing and waning, but they're going to be about 15-20% higher in terms of departing seats. So there is a chance that Chicago O'Hare has its sort of busiest year of traffic ever. I think the pre-pandemic peak where Chicago sort of hit its absolute apex was just a tick over 84 million passengers in 2019, right? 2024 was just over 80 million passengers, right? So, basically about 95% recovered. I think you could see Chicago get close to 90 million passengers, right? And actually reclaim its title as the second busiest airport in America.
Yeah.
Though they have been going out there beating their chests about how they're now the busiest airport in America, again, based on flight departure volume, but that's neither here nor.
Dallas, we're coming for you. Continuing within the American Airlines team, let's take it down south a little bit, right? So Venezuela may potentially be back on the market for American. So initially, we saw that American was one of the last airlines to fly into Venezuela in 2019, and it was one of the last ones to pull out. And as of recently, with the changes down there are intentions to presumably resume flights from Miami to Caracas and from Miami to Maracaibo. For our Venezuelan listeners, we know we have many. This could be exciting. This could be scary. This could be something that is talked about but never materializes. What are your reactions?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Venezuela historically has been one of the most important South American travel markets, both to the US and frankly for demand to Europe and to the rest of the world. And I know this is a topic that's near and dear to Hellwing's hearts, but I mean, the demand's always been there. The demand has even been there over the last few years, even as everything has gone to, you know, I was going to say hell in a handbasket. I don't know if we're allowed to curse on the podcast, right? But to, a four-letter word in a handbasket. Now, there is some lore and some history here, right? As sort of Venezuela really started to run into economic challenges during Maduro's governance, they started to play games with foreign currency, right? Like Forex became a major challenge. Airlines had trouble getting their non bolivar non is it peso bolivar is the currency.
Bolivar, Bolivar.
Yeah, not non-Bolivar earnings out of the country. Copa Airlines, I think, was the most sort of affected of the carriers just because of the massive presence that they had built there over the years. But all the U.S. carriers steadily pulled out, both because of falling off passenger demand. But I think the bigger thing, right, is you look at Africa. There's plenty of countries that are dangerous, sort of to operate into, or that have some operational challenges or passenger demand challenges that still have a through line of premium international traffic and local traffic. I think it was the combination of, and there's still plenty of wealth in Venezuela and plenty of latent travel demands. And it was really the sort of two-sided impact of both the demand impact of some of the economic challenges and of the turmoil, but then also the fact that even if you could sell the ticket, it's not entirely sure that you could actually get those funds to flow back through onto the balance sheet. So I think you'll see airlines starting to return in droves, hopefully now that Venezuela is in a more stable place. And I think a really good, sort of really instructive case is Argentina. Now, Argentina never quite sunk to the depths of Venezuela in terms of economic mismanagement and basket casedness, so to speak, right? But since the sort of rise to power of Javier Milei and some of the economic reforms that he kicked off, you've seen demand really surge in the Argentinian market. And I think the sort of optimistic case for Venezuela is that you could see something very similar happen with, the Venezuelan travel market, especially to the US. And I think the interesting dynamic there is there's actually a much larger Venezuelan diaspora in places like Florida and New York and across the United States and even in Europe and Spain, right? In the Argentina's case, it's the diaspora travel, the VFR travel folks growing, but it's especially local Argentinian demand for tourism and for business that's driving a lot of that growth. I think it's a very, very, very optimistic sort of case to be made there. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that emerges and how that develops for the next couple of years.
Right. One of the things that comes to mind for me, at least, is safety and security of cabin crew. I think that that was a major sticking point recently when a lot of airlines pulled out, not just the inability to withdraw their funds, but the safety and security of their crews on layover. If I recall correctly, United, right before it left Venezuela in 2017, they routed their flights to go Houston to Aruba, and then I think they would do a change of crew, and then it would go Aruba, Caracas, Houston. So that way the crews didn't have to overnight there. With Miami, it might be a slightly different situation because Miami is closer to Caracas. It's not more than 1,200 miles to Maracaibo, and maybe 11 to 12 to 1,300 to Caracas. So it could be out and backs, or it could be also that, American Airlines Miami based cabin crew have done layovers in Venezuela for as long as they have. And so it's not as much of an issue. Whereas the airline crews for United or for Delta, may not have as much of a comfort factor with it. So that remains to be seen.
Yeah. So I do think that, right, if you look at where these carriers are most likely to fly to Caracas from, like going back to 2013, American flew 4 daily flights to Miami, and they flew to San Juan. Miami, 1,300 miles, like you called out, very, very straightforward. Air Canada flew to Toronto. It is still 2,400 miles. It's still ultimately transcon length from Toronto, and that's about the longest flight that you have.
Right.
Delta is going to fly to Atlanta. It's about 1,900 miles. Again, it's equivalent to sort of flying from Atlanta to the West Coast, effectively, right? Is what you're looking at. And then United flew to Houston, and it's about 2,200 miles. So looking at sort of transcon length, right? A little bit shorter than a New York to Los Angeles or New York to San Francisco run. If the market is there, the airlines will find a way to make it work, to over and back their crews, right? And I think, part of what you'll need to see is the on ground situation stabilizing before the carriers rush in heavy droves. But this goes back to the notion of if you can get the money out, there are plenty of African destinations where Air France and Brussels Airlines and British Airways and Lufthansa fly crews out and fly them back. And if there's enough money to be made, the airlines will find a way to make it work, assuming you can actually get the money out. The combination of the two, I think, is what really drove the airlines to pull out of the Venezuelan market. I think Copa, meanwhile, because it's such a short flight down to Panama City, right? It's 800 or so miles. I think Copa is going to do brisk business once they're able to reestablish their foothold.
Right. And let's round out American Airlines in totality. As I mentioned earlier in this podcast, kind of having a rough start to the year. And included among that is the Robert Isom discussion, whether he is fit to be the CEO of the airline after many of the union groups voted no confidence in him. We have heard a lot of people say that they don't believe that he has the vision, the strategy, the backing of the employees to continue to lead American to better places. What are your thoughts on that?
I've been skeptical of Americans' overarching strategy for years now, and I don't think it was just downstream of Vasu Raja and some of the things that he brought to the airline from a strategic perspective. They've been directionless, and they've kind of consistently made the wrong call coming out of the pandemic. Now, is that all on Robert Isom? I think some of it is structural in terms of where the carriers hubs were made, are based. Some of that is downstream of they made a bad call with retiring those wide bodies during the pandemic, and ultimately, I think that they're paying the price for that even 6 years on now. Some of it, though, I think actually goes back to Doug Parker, right? Fundamentally, right, Doug Parker comes from the sort of US Airways heritage of almost running as a hybridized carrier, of a philosophy that says that what matters most for an airline is schedule and price and nonstop connectivity. And everything about the in flight product just has to be good enough. And that worked really, really well for US Airways in the mid 2010s. When the name of the game was how do you sort of bring down costs and run a reasonably efficient operation given the constraints of having hubs in Philadelphia, Charlotte, and Phoenix. It's not exactly a good fit for American Airlines, one of the most storied and ostensibly most premium brands in the United States that needs to be a market player in places like Chicago and New York and Los Angeles. And it's not a good fit for how travel demand patterns have evolved in the US post pandemic. Now, here's the thing United was also in a very similar boat, especially under Jeff Smizek's leadership steadily, slowly over the last 8 or 9 years, under the leadership of Oscar Munoz, and then now under Scott Kirby, especially, they've um, woken up to that fact and have repositioned themselves as a premium carrier, as a worthy sort of number two or a worthy foil to Delta, which has had kind of the longest journey of positioning themselves as that sort of premium airline and premium brand. American has the cost base of a Singapore Airlines, and they've been trying to run themselves as AirAsia, right? Like that's like one way of describing it, right? They need a revenue premium to make a profit. They have not consistently made the set of decisions that would allow them to command that revenue premium. Whether it's not having enough in international capacity, whether it's pulling back in New York and Chicago and ceding share to rivals in those markets or whether it's frankly the onboard product, right? Not having seat back screens. Yeah, it may seem unnecessary in a world of personal devices and iPads, but premium screens feel premium. They create a brand halo. And that's not as much of a brand halo as the shower on board in Emirates A380, but it's actually the same effect, right?
Yeah.
The in-flight food, the in-flight
They
wine,
don't
that
have
stuff.
hot meals for
They don't.
sale and economy, which is kind of shocking to me.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so you don't reverse course on that overnight. And the combination of not flying to the places that Americans want to pay a premium to fly to and not having a product that they deem worthy of paying that sort of paying the type of fare premium that American needs to be profitable. Yeah, I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with that. Now, the one thing that I will say is I don't know that the unions or the employee groups are blameless in this, right? it's anyone who has flown American Airlines will tell you, right, that, and this is not unique to American Airlines, but they're probably the sort of most extreme of this, right, is that the labor group's frustration with management and the way that management has been North Star oriented around on time arrivals and departures at the expense of everything else. That, amongst other sort of criticisms, has certainly flowed through into their, let's say, onboard posture, right? As someone who has flown a lot of American Airlines. And by the way, I'm probably less frustrated with the American Airlines experience because ultimately I am actually the person that cares about, do you get me there nonstop in a comfortable seat with Wi-Fi? And that's pretty much all I really need to be happy on a given flight. So I've probably flown American. I'm one of the few people that has grown the amount of American Airlines flying. I've been doing over the last couple of years. But they're not wrong to sort of call for a vote of no confidence. But they will have a role to play in reestablishing American as a premium brand and as premium experience.
Yep. Yep. And we're rooting for it. I mean, there's no reason why they can't do this, right? They have all the assets that they need. They have the talent that they need. They have the
Well, they don't have
aircraft.
the international planes that they need, and they don't
They don't
have
have
the
those.
seats that they need. And so there's things you can do to the soft product on the margins, and there's things you can do to sort of position the 787 with the premium cabins and the A321 XLRs to help drive that. But they fundamentally don't have the planes. That's a non-trivial gate on their ability to execute some of
Right.
this.
Right. Right. And so, this is the year that we hope that America kind of finds its groove again. It hopes we hope that it gets to, a more confident place with where it wants to go, and that shareholders will actually buy it. So with that said, let's move on to our final topic of the night. So that will involve Air Canada. Good old Air Canada has announced that it will be receiving 8 Airbus A350-1000s to come in the second half of 2030. So a little over 4 years away. This is on top of another wide body order that they made a few years ago with the 787-10, which will start to arrive this year. And then, of course, as we mentioned earlier in this podcast, with the Airbus A321XLR, Air Canada will be getting theirs pretty soon too. So really exciting for AC. And I assume that these A350-1000s will be the gradual replacement aircraft for some of Air Canada's very old 777-200LRs, maybe even some of their 777-300ERs. They definitely fly a lot of ultra long haul routes that will benefit from this, such as Vancouver to Sydney or from Vancouver to Bangkok into Singapore, and others maybe from Montreal to Africa, or from Toronto to the Middle East, or Toronto to India for that matter. So this fits nicely within their profile, I think. Air Canada kind of does a little bit of what United does, and maybe a little bit of what Delta does with their long haul fleet strategy. And for Airbus, this is a big win. Air Canada's fly Airbus A330-300s and have for a long time. So they've been an Airbus wide body customer for several decades now. But this is definitely a big boon for the airline from the Airbus side of the house, and also, will complement their existing long haul fleet of the Boeing 787s that they have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really, you're right to call out the 777-200 LRs as the real target of this. I think that's definitely going to be the first place where these A350s flow through. And if you look at Air Canada's fleet today, right, it's almost a one-to-one replacement for the 777-200 LR fleet, right? There's 6 of those in the fleet. There's 19 777-300ERs. You sort of stack the 8 that they have on order and 8 additional sort of purchase options. You get pretty close to replacing the majority of those for ultra long haul flying. And I think what Air Canada has said, by the way, is that they'd like to use the A350-1000 more for its range than for its capacity, right? So the 777-200 LRs, they fly a mix of longer range and shorter range flying. If you look at sort of what it looks like this summer, the 777-200 LR basically is flying, a
Delhi.
mix of, yeah. So it's basically flying Sydney to Vancouver, right, which is sort of, about 8,000 miles. Toronto to Delhi, and then it's actually being used on a series of shorter haul routes, like to Athens, to Barcelona, to Munich and to Zurich from Toronto, right? That's kind of the summer
Which can't be
utilization.
the most efficient use of that aircraft.
No, definitely not. If you look at the winter, it's Vancouver to Sydney, and Toronto to Delhi. But the real place that I think this is gonna play a role in is in replacement for the 787-9, right? That's really the workhorse of Air Canada's long haul fleet, and that's where you're seeing the 787-9 used from Vancouver to Singapore, from Vancouver to Brisbane, from Vancouver to Bangkok, from Toronto to Shanghai, from Toronto to Dubai to Osaka to Seoul. Those types of flights, I think, are where you're going to see the A350-1000 play a role, in part because that then frees up the 787-9 to fly to even thinner destinations, as well as on shorter haul routings to Europe, where it is more efficient than 30 300. So I think there's some interesting sort of like flow through and kind of roll through. It's not clear to me that linearly the first replacement mission of the A350-1000 is going to be on the 777-300ER.
Yep, absolutely. Well, good for Air Canada. Our Skytrax 5-star winner to the north, because Skytrax is what we all believe in. Just kidding. Minor dig there. And good for Airbus. 51,000 is an exciting aircraft. I've flown it twice, both on Etihad. Very smooth, very sleek. And I guess this will make it the first North American carrier that has ordered that aircraft.
Well,
Unless
Delta has
has.
orders for the A350,
Right.
right?
And
And
Delta has also ordered the 787-10.
yep.
So,
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, you've seen this on the wide body side, or sorry, on the narrow body side, right? Where increasingly the sort of largest member of the family gains more and more market share over time with the A321 and the 737 MAX 10. And I think you're now seeing the A350-1000 and the 787-10 especially really start to capture more and more share. In particular on the 787-10, because Boeing has done a series of upgrades that allow that plane to fly a lot further. It's actually kind of very similar to the story that you saw with the A330-300 and with the 777-200 in the early days of those aircraft, right? The version of the 777-200 versus the 200ER, and then the version of the A330 especially, right? The early A330s would struggle to make many transatlantic missions, and today can kind of fly end to end from anywhere in North America to pretty much anywhere in continental Europe. The 787-10 was sort of designed from the base to be able to fly, any of those missions, but now is a legitimate transatlantic um, uh, aircraft, or sorry, trans-Pacific aircraft, especially in Air Canada's case for their Vancouver.
well, I think that concludes our topics for today. Basically, yeah, we are now heading into season 10, and we're excited for what content might come our way. It's been a little quiet over the last couple weeks in airline world, which is okay. We want things to be quiet. There's definitely always going to be some chaos that comes the way of this industry, so nothing is ever fully predictable. And any final remarks, Vinay?
No, I'm just excited for another season of airline soap opera and drama, and excited to see what the rest of 2026 brings.
All right. Thanks so much to our listeners, to our producer, Helwing, and we'll be back at you with episode 3.